Dave B Racing is P3. Best lap is a 1:21.020. Toddy Mustang is P1. Jason Short is second. That Canadian guy from Canada is 7th on standards. Dave B Racing from South Africa is second. Best lap is a 1:20.634. Toddy Mustang is first. Dave B Racing is second. The qualification session is at Pukekohe Park Raceway in Pukekohe Park, New Zealand. Dave B Racing from South Africa is second on standards. The race dictator from New Zealand is first on standards. Toddy Mustang from New Zealand is 6th on standards. Jason Short from New Zealand is P3 on standards. Toddy Mustang is P6. The race dictator is first. The race dictator improved is P1 with a 121.446. Jason Short is provisional pole with a 120.820. Ethan Bruce 777 is P4. Ethan Bruce 777 improved is fourth with a 123.396. 2.576 off pole. That Canadian guy from Canada is P6 on standards. Best lap is a 128.940. 8.120 off pole. Toddy Mustang is second up 0.28. The race dictator is P3 up 0.15. Toddy Mustang is P2 up 0.25. Toddy Mustang improved is P2 with a 120.992. 0.172 off pole. Five minutes remaining in the session. Dave B Racing is P4 up 0.32. Dave B Racing improved is third with a 121.304. 0.484 off pole. Jason Short is P1. The race dictator is P4 up 0.23. The race dictator improved is fourth with a 121.424. 0.604 off pole. Toddy Mustang is second. Best lap is a 120.992. 0.172 off pole. That Canadian guy is P5 on standards. That Canadian guy improved is fifth with a 122.320. 1.500 off pole. Toddy Mustang is second. Ethan Bruce 777 is P6 on standards. Best lap is a 1:23.396. 2.576 off pole. That Canadian guy is P5 up 0.20. That Canadian guy improved his fifth with a 1:22.048. 1.228 off pole. Jason Short is first. That Canadian guy is P5. Best lap is a 1:22.048. 1.228 off pole. Dave B Racing is P3. Best lap is a 1:21.304. 0.484 off pole. The qualifying session is now in overtime. Ethan Bruce 777 is sixth. Dave B Racing is third. Ethan Bruce 777 is sixth on standards. Dave B Racing is P3. Broadcast Bot is P17 on standards driving a Mazda RX-3. The race session is at Pukekohe Park Raceway in Pukekohe Park, New Zealand. Jason Short is first. Toddy Mustang from New Zealand is second on standards. 20 minutes remaining in the session. Race start. Dave B Racing from South Africa is P3 on standards. Toddy Mustang is second. Dave B Racing is fifth. Toddy Mustang is second. Toddy Mustang passed Jason Short for P1. Dave B Racing is fifth. The Race Dictator from New Zealand is fourth on standards. Dave B Racing is fifth, 0.7 behind the Race Dictator. Dave B Racing is now fourth. Jason Short from New Zealand is P6 on standards, 0.5 behind Ethan Bruce 777. Dave B Racing is P4, 0.6 behind the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is third on standards, 0.7 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P4, 0.4 behind the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is third, 0.4 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P4 battling the Race Dictator. Dave B Racing passed the Race Dictator for P3. The Race Dictator from New Zealand is fourth, 0.6 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.5 ahead of the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is P4. Best lap is a 1:21.922. 1.115 off the fastest lap. Dave B Racing on lap 4 is third, 0.6 ahead of the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is P4, 0.8 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing was 1.0 faster last lap. 15 minutes remaining in the session. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.9 ahead of the Race Dictator. Dave B Racing was 1.0 faster last lap. The Race Dictator is fourth, 1.2 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3 on standards, 1.4 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is P4, 1.3 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third, 1.1 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is P4, 1.2 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing on lap 6 is third, 1.1 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P4, 1.5 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3, 1.1 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is fourth, 1.7 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3, 1.0 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P4, 2.1 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing was 0.6 faster last lap. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.7 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is fourth on standards, 2.5 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third, 0.6 behind that Canadian guy. Dave B Racing was 0.8 faster last lap. Ten minutes remaining in the session. The race dictator is fourth on standards, 2.7 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.9 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P4, 3.2 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing was 0.6 faster last lap. Dave B Racing is third, 0.8 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P4, 2.7 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third, 0.6 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator on lap 9 is P4, 3.5 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third. Best lap is a 1:20.783. The race dictator is fourth, 3.3 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third. The race dictator is fourth, 4.1 ahead of Jason Short. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.4 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is fourth, 3.8 ahead of Jason Short. Dave B Racing is third, 0.1 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P4 on standards, 3.3 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing from South Africa is P3, 0.3 behind that Canadian guy. Jason Short is fifth, 3.5 behind the race dictator. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.5 behind that Canadian guy. 5 minutes remaining in the session. Jason Short is fifth, 3.3 behind the race dictator. Dave B Racing is P3 on standards, 0.8 behind that Canadian guy. Jason Short is fifth, 2.9 behind the race dictator. Jason Short was 0.6 faster last lap. Dave B Racing is third, 1.7 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P4, 2.9 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third on standards, 1.6 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P4. Best lap is a 121.409. 0.626 off the fastest lap. Dave B Racing is P3, 1.0 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P4 on standards, 2.9 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3, 1.3 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is fourth on standards, 2.9 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3. The race dictator on lap 14 is P4, 2.9 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3. The race dictator is fourth, 2.5 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing on lap 15 is third, 1.0 behind that Canadian guy. The leader has just finished the race. Toddy Mustang finished P1. That Canadian guy from Canada finished P2. Dave B Racing finished P3. The race dictator finished P4. Jason Short finished 5th. Ethan Bruce 777 is 6th. Ethan Bruce 777 finished P6. Broadcast bot is 7th. The race session is at Pukekohe Park Raceway in Pukekohe Park, New Zealand. Ethan Bruce 777 is P1 on standards. 20 minutes remaining in the session. Race start. Ethan Bruce 777 is now P6. Dave B Racing from South Africa is second on standards. That Canadian guy from Canada is third on standards. Dave B Racing is P2. That Canadian guy is P3. Dave B Racing is P2. That Canadian guy is P3, 2.5 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is second, 0.5 behind Jason Short. That Canadian guy from Canada is third, 2.9 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P2, 0.2 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing passed Jason Short for first. Jason Short from New Zealand is P2 on standards, 0.3 behind Dave B Racing. That Canadian guy from Canada is third, 2.0 behind Jason Short. Jason Short from New Zealand is P2. 0.4 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing was 0.8 faster last lap. Jason Short is now first. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.7 behind that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is P2, 0.3 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third, 0.2 behind that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is P2, 0.3 ahead of Dave B Racing. That Canadian guy was 2.5 faster last lap. Dave B Racing is P3. Best lap is a 121.365. 0.971 off the fastest lap. 15 minutes remaining in the session. That Canadian guy is second, 0.7 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third on standards, 0.5 behind that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is second. Best lap is a 120.912. 0.518 off the fastest lap. Dave B Racing on lap 5 is P3, 0.9 behind that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is second on standards, 0.7 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3, 0.8 behind that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is P2, 0.7 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3 on standards, 0.6 behind that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is P2 on standards, 0.7 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third, 1.8 behind that Canadian guy. Toddy Mustang from New Zealand is fourth on standards, 2.6 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is third, 2.3 behind that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy was 1.4 faster last lap. Toddy Mustang is P4. Best lap is a 120.394. Toddy Mustang passed Dave B Racing for P3. That Canadian guy on lap 7 is P2, 2.8 behind Jason Short. Jason Short was 0.6 faster last lap. Toddy Mustang is P3. That Canadian guy on lap 7 is second, 0.5 behind Jason Short. Ten minutes remaining in the session. Dave B Racing is P5, 0.1 behind the race dictator. Dave B Racing passed the race dictator for P4. The race dictator from New Zealand is P5 on standards, 0.6 behind Dave B Racing. That Canadian guy is P2, 0.3 behind Jason Short. That Canadian guy was 2.6 faster last lap. Toddy Mustang from New Zealand is P3, 0.2 ahead of Dave B Racing. Toddy Mustang was 2.9 faster last lap. That Canadian guy is second, 0.3 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing was 0.7 faster last lap. Toddy Mustang is P4, 0.1 behind Dave B Racing. Toddy Mustang passed Dave B Racing for P3. That Canadian guy on lap 8 is P2, 0.6 behind Jason Short. Toddy Mustang is P3, 0.9 behind that Canadian guy. Toddy Mustang was 3.6 faster last lap. That Canadian guy is second, 1.0 ahead of Toddy Mustang. Toddy Mustang from New Zealand is third, 1.3 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is fifth, 0.9 ahead of Dave B Racing. Toddy Mustang is third, 0.3 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is fifth on standards, 0.1 behind Ethan Bruce 777. The race dictator lost P5 to Dave B Racing. That Canadian guy is third, 0.2 behind Toddy Mustang. That Canadian guy passed Toddy Mustang for second. Toddy Mustang from New Zealand is P3, 0.1 behind that Canadian guy. Dave B Racing is P5, 0.8 behind Ethan Bruce 777. Dave B Racing was 2.8 faster last lap. That Canadian guy is P3, 0.7 behind Toddy Mustang. Ethan Bruce 777 is 5th, 0.1 behind Dave B Racing. The race dictator is P6, 0.9 behind Ethan Bruce 777. Five minutes remaining in the session. Ethan Bruce 777 is P5 on standards, 0.3 behind Dave B Racing. The race dictator is P6, 0.6 behind Ethan Bruce 777. Ethan Bruce 777 is P5, 0.4 behind Dave B Racing. The race dictator is P6. Best lap is a 121.434, 1.040 off the fastest lap. Toddy Mustang is second, 1.0 behind Jason Short. Ethan Bruce 777 is 5th, 0.5 ahead of the race dictator. Toddy Mustang is second, 0.7 behind Jason Short. Ethan Bruce 777 is 5th, 0.4 behind Dave B Racing. Toddy Mustang is P2, 0.3 behind Jason Short. Ethan Bruce 777 on lap 12 is P5, 0.4 behind Dave B Racing. Toddy Mustang is second, 0.4 behind Jason Short. The race dictator from New Zealand is P5, 0.6 ahead of Dave B Racing. Toddy Mustang is second, 0.2 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is 5th. Best lap is a 121.164. 0.814 off the fastest lap. Toddy Mustang is P2, 0.4 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is 5th, 0.5 behind the race dictator. Toddy Mustang is P2, 0.7 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is 5th, 0.6 behind the race dictator. Toddy Mustang is 2nd, 0.5 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is 5th, 0.4 behind the race dictator. The race dictator was 1.4 faster last lap. Toddy Mustang is 2nd, 0.3 behind Jason Short. Dave B Racing is P5, 0.3 behind the race dictator. Toddy Mustang is P2, 0.3 behind Jason Short. The race dictator from New Zealand is P5, 0.3 behind Dave B Racing. The leader has just finished the race. Jason Short finished 1st. Toddy Mustang finished P2. That Canadian guy finished P3. Dave B Racing finished P4. The race dictator finished P5. Ethan Bruce 7